Upstream listeners, we're excited to announce Colson Center National Conference online for just $49. You can learn from Justin Bailey, Stephen Meyer, Briston Wagoner, and many more speakers from our annual Christian Worldview Conference. And if you use promo code UPSTREAM, you can receive $5 off. That's promo code UPSTREAM. For more information about this on-demand experience, visit colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. At the end of the 1993 comedy Mrs. Doubtfire, Robin Williams, in the persona of the elderly female title character and TV personality, explains divorce to his child audience. Some parents, when they're angry, get along much better when they don't live together. They don't fight all the time, and they can become better people and much better mommies and daddies for you. And sometimes they get back together, and sometimes they don't, dear. And if they don't blame yourself. Just because they don't love each other anymore doesn't mean that they don't love you. Well, I suppose the director thought this scene was touching. It certainly reflects the popular wisdom of the time about divorce, that children are resilient and that they're better off if mommy and daddy are happy instead of fighting all the time. This popular wisdom has colored the whole of the sexual revolution, as our society has spent decades pursuing ever more trivial and niche forms of adult desire. It has continued to repeat the mantra, the kids will be all right. But are they? What if there's another side to the sexual revolution and its endless demands for new rights? What if our attempts to redefine and redesign age-old human institutions are actually costing one group of people, a group who cannot vote and cannot defend themselves, dearly? Well, my guest today has devoted her career to raising that question and forcing adults to answer it. Katy Faust is president of the organization Them Before Us and author of the book Them Before Us: Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement, as well as the forthcoming book Raising Conservative Kids in a Woke City. She recently wrote a piece at The Federalist entitled 9 Children on the Devastating Moment They Learned Their Parents' Marriage Was Over. She's got a lot of powerful things to say on this subject, and I'm excited to chat. Katy Faust, welcome to Upstream.
It's great to talk with you again today. For those of you who aren't regular listeners, Shane is an incredible interviewer. And so there's a little bit of trepidation going into this because he always asks questions that nobody else asks. So let's just hope I'm ready for Shane Morris today.
Well, that's the goal, Katy, is to get into a habit of producing interviews that people will look to and say, I want to know what that person really thinks. So I'm going to look for the Upstream interview because everyone else just asks him the stock questions from the media press kit, but Shane drills down to the real subject matter. That's the goal anyway. I don't know if we always achieve it, but...
Well, you do it for me. I love the interviews. It's been great.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. This article at The Federalist, it hit me between the eyes as a dad in a way that most things I read online throughout the week just don't. I want to know what prompted it and why you think stories like this matter so much.
The reason why this came up is The Cut, which is a huge publication on the left. They came out with the stories of women, 9 women on the moment they knew their divorce, that their marriage was over. And so it goes through, similar to my article, kind of the circumstances that led up to the moment when these women knew either my marriage is over because my husband has left, but more commonly, my marriage is over because there's all these things that have taken place that I just can't put up with anymore. And some of them are genuine struggles. Marriage is hard. Some of it personality conflict. Some of it was infidelity. Some of it was dishonesty. Some of it, as a pastor's wife and somebody who does marriage counseling for people struggling, I'm like, oh, there's another side to that story, honey. But, it was all the women's perspective on why their divorce, why their marriage needed to, and why divorce was what had to happen. And I understand marriage is challenging. I've been in a marriage for 25 years. We're in ministry. My husband's a pastor. And so I don't have any illusions about how challenging marriage can be.
It's not all rainbows and sunshine all the time?
Not always. Not always. It's glorious and wonderful. But to get to the glorious and wonderful, a lot of times you go through valleys. You have to deal with people that are drastically different than you are living in the same room a lot of the time. So it's hard. And so I empathize with the women who are going through these challenges. But why did I write the article? Because The Cut Most major publications, mainstream media, most platforms rarely to never acknowledge that there is a primary cost being leveled on the kids when these decisions are made. And it is their story that should be central. It is their narrative that should capture our attention when we are thinking about matters of marriage and family. So this was just a bit of a microcosm of what I feel like is the dominant pattern when we talk about marriage and family, which is an obsessive focus on who adults are, what they want, their own identities, their own desires, at the expense of children's rights and thriving. So what I've tried to do in my book, and certainly you see it in this article, is to say, let's look at this from the kids' perspective. So I solicited contributions from children of divorce. And I said, tell me about the moment you knew that your parents' marriage was over. Let's flip the script here, right? So here we've got this somewhat kind of heartstrings, oh, I really empathize with that woman and why she really needed to just get out of that relationship sort of narrative from the cut, to let's take a look from the kids' perspective. What was going on in their home before and after, and how did it affect their life? So I got more than enough submissions because partially because I said, I'm going to verify who you are, but you can tell your story anonymously. And that typically is what it takes for kids to be honest about the suffering that they've endured in their childhood, because overwhelmingly, whenever there's family brokenness, what you've got kids doing hard things on behalf of adults. Like that literally is what happens when adults prioritize what they want above children's rights and needs. Is now the child is bearing the burden, and they continue to bear that burden into adulthood. So once you can promise them, look, you can do this under a pseudonym, there was so much material, it was really hard to narrow it down to 9.
Why is it so hard for kids to speak out on the pain and grief and damage psychologically and spiritually that they've endured as a result of something like divorce? Obviously, we don't want to just focus on divorce because there are lots of other ways that adults damage the lives of kids, and we'll talk about those. But divorce is one of the most perennial and I guess the oldest manifestations of the sexual revolution, of this focus on adults. But why is it so hard? What's keeping kids from coming out under their own names and saying, Mom, Dad, or Mom and Mom, or Dad and Dad, you hurt me?
You know, the way that it's supposed to go is adults are supposed to be supportive, understanding, and accommodating of kids. That's kind of the definition of who the adult is in the relationship. That's what adults are supposed to do, right? They're the ones that understand there's hardships, there's challenges in the world. I am going to take on the burden of those challenges so that I can accommodate what you need. I can support what you need. I can be understanding if you go through a struggle. And what divorce does, very, very often, except in rare cases, and really what all other forms of intentional parental loss in all these other forms of modern family does, is it insists that children be understanding, supportive, and accommodating on behalf of parents. And kids often take that into their adulthood. And you'll hear that in the stories, right? I was responsible for, figuring out how they're going to get along. And I became the second parent now that my dad was gone or my mom was gone, or I felt responsible for this or that. And so I think that there is something that happens in childhood that is involuntary because the adults have failed to do the hard thing on behalf of kids. And then those children of divorce grow up into it and continue in many ways to be the caretaker of their parents in terms of sometimes their emotional well-being, sometimes mediating between warring parents. So that's number one. We, at Them Before Us, gather stories of kids in all forms of modern family, whether it's kids with 2 moms and 2 dads or children created through third-party reproduction. And this is actually a feature that all children in those modern families share, is that they are very fearful about telling the truth under their own names. And that is because if they do, it has the possibility of destabilizing their primary relationships. And even though these people have caused them pain, it's still their primary relationships. And so telling the truth is pretty costly for children when it comes to highlighting how their parents have failed them.
This is so difficult because the immediate response that you'll get, and I think this is characteristic of our time and our culture, and the way we're taught to deal with these difficult issues. But the immediate response you'll get is, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? What about an abusive husband? What about infidelity? What about a environment that's literally not safe for the kids? What about, there's all these adult scenarios that we come up with that I guess are supposed to justify the divorce and then also preclude any sort of damage or pain that the children suffer. And that's a very odd thing. As I was talking with John Stonestreet about this recently, we were setting up for a commentary, and we don't talk about any other form of injury, psychological or physical, that way. Like when you get an amputation, when you amputate a limb because it's cancerous or it's infected or something like that, that can save your life. That may very well be necessary, but you're still down a limb. I mean, you're still crippled for life at that point. You still have lost a great deal of your function and mobility and all kinds of capabilities. It hurts. It's a painful thing, and it will be painful for the rest of your life. Why is it that when it comes to this one thing of divorce or any other, I guess, scenario in which children are asked to foot the bill for adult desires or necessities, we insist on saying, no, because I had a good reason, you can't hurt. You're not allowed to tell your story or be, disappointed by how it came out.
I don't know if it's just divorce. To me, I actually see this pattern on most kind of culture war, social issue topics, where the left will take an exception and then use it to argue against the rule. And so you see that with the intersex debate, right? Some people aren't clearly male or female, therefore there must be all these multiple genders, right? Well, some women conceive children through rape, therefore we must, necessitate abortion on demand up until birth. And so I actually see that this is the most common tactic used on the left to say, let's take this tragedy and exception and use it to overturn the rule. Now, the reason why I think that it is somewhat effective in divorce is because there are justifiable reasons to leave a marriage. Abuse, adultery. We used to have a system to determine when a divorce was acceptable, and we called that at-fault divorce. Somebody was at fault for breaking the vow of committing to one another in richer or for poorer, in sickness and health, for better or worse, till death do us part. There was a vow there. And sometimes people were found to be at fault of breaking that vow. And so there have historically been, even biblically, there's been reasons to dissolve a marriage. But we take those exceptions, right? Even Jesus said, yeah, that was an exception. We did that because your hearts were like stone cold hard, right? But the exception should not be used to overturn the rule. So why is that? What I have found is in all of these different areas where the exceptions are being used to justify overturning the self-evident norm is because we have a new God. The new God is sex. And when the God is sex, when your God is sex and sex is connected to children, children are the required sacrifice on the altar of your God. And so you will go through all kinds of self-justifications, and now we've seen legal justifications, so that you can serve and worship your God wholeheartedly. And that means kids are going to pay the price.
It's amazing what will sacrifice children in order to attain. Like, as I said earlier, it's becoming more and more sort of niche and tenuous. Many of the desires that we're pursuing, it's not like life, liberty, and property. It's stuff like the ability to self-actualize by having and raising a child, despite the fact that I have a gay partner, to take like Pete Buttigieg's example, and we biologically are incompatible for reproduction. We're two males. We lack half of what's necessary in order to actually have a child. Nevertheless, we conceive ourselves as having a right to a child so thoroughly that we are actually able and allowed to create one in a lab and enlist the body and help of a hired woman who will act as and we don't even call her a mother. We don't dignify her with human language. We call her a surrogate, who then will produce that child for us so that we can have our photo shoot and, sit there and act like we just went through labor and delivery. It's this is a desire that I think even same-sex couples or gay identified people in decades past would have looked at and kind of just laughed at. or scratch their heads at. Because if you're gay, it's part of the deal. You're not going to have kids. Not with that person. And so but we have come to imagine that our rights to children, and that I'm using that language advisedly, not because I agree with it, but that our right to have a child, right? Our right to fulfill this adult desire is so complete that we can actually re-engineer the way nature itself works in order to attain that. And we will never talk about the needs and wants and rights of the child who we bring into existence with a pre-existing mother wound or a pre-existing father wound, this gap in their lives. It's amazing how tenuous and ridiculous a lot of these rights are, these claimed rights are becoming.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, we spend a little time addressing that in the first chapter of our book, where the term rights has been so abused and misused and adulterated. I mean, that's the right term. It's been adulterated to, in essence, legitimize anything adults want sexually, right? A right to choose, a right to parenthood, a right to marry. If you're looking at pure natural rights, those are not rights. But now, because adult sexual desire has become God, we now use the rights language to justify it. And when we misuse rights, unsurprisingly, it is legitimate child rights which are always sacrificed, especially when it comes to sex. It is their right to life and their right to their mother and father that will be required if we are going to fulfill adult sexual rights. So I actually did a video for the Colson Center on the What Would You Say platform, kind of saying, are children's rights incompatible with parental rights? Which one wins? And the answer is, when you properly define children's rights and parental rights, they perfectly complement one another. But the trick is understanding what rights really are, how we know what they are, and then using them appropriately. So we've got to get serious about sort of the philosophical underpinnings of these conversations, because they have very real practical applications. And when we get them wrong, they have very real victims. And those victims always happen to be children.
Katy, have you interacted at all with the work of Carl Trueman on expressive individualism? I'm sure you're aware of it, but have you kind of done some thinking or talking about how those ideas and the historical story he's telling could shed light on this weird transition that the concept of rights and sexual rights in particular have gone through?
I read Carl Trueman for Dummies version of that one, The Brave New World. I didn't read the one for the PhDs.
The tome.
The tome. Yeah. And of course, I think that he says better. I mean, I always say adult sexual desire, but he's right. That this is really a whole new concept of the self that is all encompassing and demands fealty and sacrifice. So he's exactly right. I'll just be the groupie that is right behind him.
Yeah, I wonder if the broader Christian world, as we try to grapple with the difficulties the sexual revolution creates, I wonder if we're sufficiently aware, and I doubt that we are, of the emotional and psychological freight that people have invested in these sexual rights. And so when someone says, I want a child despite being gay, or I want a more fulfilling marriage, I'm tired of mine, I'm going to leave it and leave my kids, or I'm going to hire a surrogate, or there are lots of examples we could pick from here where the kid foots the bill. When someone says those things, they're not just saying, I want this living good that we call a child. Oftentimes, the child is actually an accessory to something else that's going on within the adult psychologically, which is this expressive individualism, which is the idea that there's an identity that I want to pursue, and I have a right to have that facilitated, regardless of the sort of scientific or medical or social or legal barriers that I have to cross. And this is where, this goes back to the very logic of gay marriage itself, which was this pivotal point in the United States and elsewhere of redefining what marriage itself and the family are. It takes this time immemorial, this definition from time immemorial, and says there's a desire that we have based on who we are. And that's the identity language there. It's we need to express who we are. And so therefore we have a right to restructure society and our legal system and our families and everything that we've assumed up until 5 minutes ago in order to facilitate that one. And I guess for me, that's helpful, Katy, because when I see children having to foot the bill, I get mad. I just want to tell the adults, grow up and be willing to think about someone other than yourself for once. But when I realize that they really are thinking about themselves in a deeper sense than I'm actually acknowledging, that selfhood has become a kind of existential faith for them, that this is their reason for existing and reason for being, almost like a religion or a worldview. It's gone beyond the realm of ideology. It doesn't make me more sympathetic to it, but it at least helps me understand, I guess, where they're coming from. And maybe that's a synonym for sympathy. I don't know, but it makes more sense that way.
I was on a phone call with John Stonestreet a couple months ago, and he said, there's three different sort of players in this sort of culture war landscape we find ourselves in. And he said thought leaders, translators, and policymakers. And the thought leaders are the people with the big ideas, the theologians, the academics. I'd say breakpoint people are really in the thought leader category. You've got some awesome people helping you do the communicating. Then, there's people out there or incredible organizations that are saying, let's take these ideas, let's put them into policy. I'm a communicator. So I like to read and listen to Shane Morris, and I like to read Robert George and Yoram Hazony, and I like to consume the thought leaders. But just like you, I don't think that way myself. To me, I'm just like, don't touch the kids. It doesn't need to be deep thinking. For me, I'm just like, I understand you're struggling. I can empathize with that. Don't touch the kids. Don't touch the kids. And so I think that I come from a little more of a guttural perspective from all of this. And that is why, at Them Before Us, we actually group every marriage and family issue together. We look at the definition of marriage. We look at divorce and what scenarios are permissible. We evaluate same-sex parenting. We look at sperm and egg donation and surrogacy and who adoption should serve and cohabitation and polygamy. Really, we look at all of those issues. They are not separate issues. They are really all the same question. And the question is, who's doing the hard thing? Who in those situations is doing the hard thing? Is it the adults in the struggling marriage? Is it the person with same-sex attraction? Is it the couple dealing with infertility? Is it the single woman that desperately wants children and would be a great mom? Is it the couple that is looking to adopt or the child that needs to be adopted? Is it the people that feel like their identity is polyamorous? Like, who's going to do the hard things in those situations? Somebody's going to do the hard thing. Is it going to be the adults who bend their desire and their will for the sake of the child so the child can have their natural rights to be known and loved by their mother and father protected? Or will it be the child? Is it going to be the children that sacrifice their right to be known and loved by both their mother every single day in a stable relationship, the one vehicle that we know maximizes their thriving, right? Or is it going to be the kids? In those situations, somebody's going to do the hard thing. It's going to be the adults or it's going to be the child. And for me, I say I want to empathize with the adults struggling with infertility or the ones that are in the challenging marriage or the single woman that would be an incredible mom who just hasn't found Mr. Right, or my friends who experience same-sex attraction who would be a great dad or a great mom or whatever it is. I want to bear your burden and walk through that with you. But don't touch the kids. So it really, for me, I want to read Carl Trueman. I do read Carl Trueman. I appreciate Carl Trueman. But what gets me off the couch is don't make kids sacrifice for you. That is an injustice, and you will have to go through me if you try.
What makes your message so powerful and effective, I think, is, well, part of it is that you're speaking in some ways the native language of the justice movements of our time. So one of the deep self-understandings of all the social justice advocates out there is that they are defenders of the weak. They're sticking up for the little guy. They are champions of the underdog. They care about those who have no voice, who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who are, subjugated in society and don't have the ability to speak out and defend themselves, right? Now, the problem with that is you end up defining certain categories out of humanity, out of existence, or out of their harm, their right to explain and express the pain they've felt as a result of adult arrangements. So kids are primarily the ones that fall into that category. And the most obvious dramatic example of that is abortion, right? So we're going to stick up for the small and weak, except for the literal most small and most weak of all. They get steamrolled by the social justice left. But children after birth also have sort of fallen between the cracks of those oppression and advocacy categories that we're going to stand up for the weak, except for the ones who have to foot the bill emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically for adult desires and divorce and things like that. So I think your message is powerful because it speaks a language that many folks who wouldn't otherwise be predisposed to care about children's rights begin to hear. It's very difficult for them to look at, you get up and give the presentation where you point at the picture of the little girl and say, this is a child, right? This is a little child, and she exists whether you want her to or not. She has rights whether you want her to or not. And things that you do as an adult will have an effect on her, negatively or positively, whether you want them to or not. Oh, and the last thing, the thing you mentioned a moment ago, that if somebody has to sacrifice, if somebody has to sort of bend or curb their desires in order for the good of the other to prevail, it should be the adults. It shouldn't have to be her. It shouldn't have to be the little girl, the little kid, the little boy. They're the last person who should have to sacrifice. And that's a powerful message. And I think it's very difficult. Like you even said in one of the talks I watched, it's very difficult for even a very progressive adult to say, no, the child should definitely have to sacrifice. Their typical move is to try some wizardry to make the harm go away or deny that it's even a big deal at all.
Well, and they don't have to work that hard to justify it to themselves, because right now, the three forces that have worked to transform the family are all on the side of justifying adult desire. We've had a legal transformation in this country that began with no-fault divorce. When that was the original redefinition of marriage, where we said, marriage doesn't need to be permanent. If you're not happy, then the marriage can end. And that was the first time that we said, actually, marriage is not really, it doesn't need to be the most child-friendly institution the world has ever known because it unites the two people to whom children have a natural right for life. No, this is really just a vehicle of adult fulfillment. And gay marriage capitalized on that message. And they said, well, if this is just a vehicle of adult fulfillment, being married to another man fulfills me, or another woman fulfills me. So first permanence is gone, then complementarity is gone. And now we've got monogamy on the chopping block because the polygamists are on the rise, and all different kinds of, we've had a couple towns in Massachusetts that have legalized it, a couple judicial cases that have normalized it or cracked the door open for it, and the push is on for polygamy, right? So we've had the legal world that is elevating adult sexual desire to the primary place when it comes to marriage and family formation. We've also had these cultural changes, right? And I've done some videos with Colson Center on this too. Love makes a family, right? Biology doesn't matter. Love makes a family, and the kids will be fine, right? Kids are resilient. That
love makes a family line is actually one of the things that Robin Williams' character says in Mrs. Doubtfire. He's like, some people have this arrangement and that arrangement and this other arrangement. And it's not early enough or it's too early for him to include two mommies or two daddies or whatever in the movie. But you can tell that's the direction it's going. And he says, but none of that matters, dear, as long as there's love. If there's love, that's a real family. Those are the ties that bind, he says. But they don't bind because they're not based in nature. They're not real. That's wishful thinking.
Yeah, because it's adult sexual love. Right? That's the kind of love that he's talking about. That kind of love doesn't last a lifetime, and it does not engender the sort of protective bonds that children need. And we know what makes a family. We know, well, I should put it this way. If we really think that love is the critical aspect of the family, and we believe that children should be safe and loved, then we believe that children should be raised by their married biological mother and father for life. Because we have the data that shows that children are most likely to be safe and loved in that nuclear natural family. So, their talking points are rebutted by reality, not just the statistical reality, but also the reality of the 9 kids that we interviewed for the Federalist article. I went back and I reviewed some of the words that these kids used to describe themselves. It's not just once I actually pulled all 9 quotes and decided which ones I wanted to use, I was like, what is the theme here of these 9? It drastically changed how these kids saw themselves and what they were able to accomplish in their own relationships. And the adults in their lives were fulfilled and happy and largely glad, just like the 9 women in the Cut article who said, oh, this is just what I needed to do. That's fine for you, the adults. What did it leave the kids with? They felt unloved, abandoned, ashamed, afraid, dirty, like they were a second-class citizen, devastated. And these are descriptors that they use not just for themselves as the 9-year-old kid, but as themselves as a 25-year-old mom. So I just think, the adults who have decided to justify their formation of a family that excludes a child's mother or father have been able to find support from our changing legal system. They have been able to find support through our dominant cultural narratives. And now, thanks to technology, they're able to find that kind of support through these dehumanizing technological advances that allows you to cut a child off from their mother or father at conception. So right now, there really are very few places where adults are going to run up against the reality that actually you need to sacrifice for your kid. Because who's saying that? A lot of churches won't even have the guts to do it.
I'm talking today with Katy Faust, author of Them Before Us and a bold voice on children's rights. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this. As we at the Colson Center like to say, redemption is always personal, but it's never private. When we are restored in Christ, God gives us a work of restoration to do in the world. But no Christian is called to do that work alone. That's why we seek to build strategic partnerships with like-minded Christian organizations, like Focus on the Family, the Association of Christian Schools International, and more, to bring comprehensive worldview training to believers in every context, from Fortune 500 companies to middle school history classrooms. As we approach the end of our fiscal year, we need your help to continue strengthening our partnerships and bringing worldview training to more believers than ever. To partner with us in equipping Christians everywhere to live out their faith wherever God calls them, give today at colsoncenter.org/FYE23. We're back on Upstream, talking with Katy Faust, author of Them Before Us, and one of our time's boldest voices on children's rights. Katy, we're discussing this kind of primal wound that strikes at a child's heart when he or she loses a parent, is deprived of a parent in some way, or deprived of that bond and permanence between parents in which we are all ideally supposed to begin. What is it? I'm curious, because I know you've done a lot of deep thinking about this, and I want to open the floor for a little bit of speculation or theorizing, or maybe you've got hard data on this. What is it about marriage that undergirds children's very identities? Why is it that these common themes emerge when you interview kids of divorce, for example, and they say, "I felt guilty, I felt dirty." What they're saying, reading between the lines, is that I was dehumanized, I was unselfed, my identity was taken from me. What is it about marriage that gives children their identity, and why is it that taking it away from them, taking their parents away from them, does such terrible things?
Yeah, I think that we have failed to understand how drastically formative it is to be raised by your own mom and dad. And I think some of that is something that even the church has been reluctant to talk about, because we understand the goodness and the redemptive nature of adoption. And we don't ever want to demonize or make it sound like we don't support adoptive parents and adoptive children. And so I'm saying this as an adoptive mom myself. Before I became a mom, I was the assistant director at the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. I am pro-adoption when that institution is properly understood as a child-centric mechanism. So I think, though, that we have lowballed the importance of a child's own mother and father connecting to and investing in them. We spend all of chapter 2 of the book talking about the importance of a biological connection between parent and child. One thing I've already mentioned is that if you are looking for adults who are statistically the most invested in, connected to, and protective of children, the numbers make a clear and really uncontestable case that it is the child's own biological parents that are going to maximize investment in terms of time, money, connectedness, but also protectiveness. Like evolutionary biologists have actually coined a phrase for the disadvantage that children experience who are raised outside of that biological mother-father system, and it's called the Cinderella effect. It is exactly what you think it is. It is that children who are raised by a non-related adult, a stepmother, a stepfather, mother's boyfriend, are at drastic disadvantage when it comes to care, investment, and protection. And I often play this little game with this horrible little game with people that I'm talking to at conferences or whatever, where I say, pull your phone out, Google the words mother's boyfriend, and let me know what you find. And so I'm like, I'll do that to you now. Pause this podcast, Google the words mother's boyfriend, and then come back. How'd that go for you?
Yeah, I did it while listening to your talk. And I couldn't believe it. Yeah, it was like result after result is just about abuse. It's about, horror stories of what happened to kids when they were in these environments.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, if love makes a family, those kids should be just fine because the adults are all sexually fulfilled in those relationships, right? The boyfriend, the mother. Love does not make a family. Very often in those situations, loss makes a family. And in the worst situations, child abuse and neglect and child death makes a family in some of those cases. So first of all, why is it that this is so critical to children? Well, because it's actually the venue where children are the most likely to not just thrive, but also survive. So the second reason why defending this fundamental child right to both their mother and father, which requires all adults to bend, all adults, married adults, single adults, same-sex attracted adults, infertile adults, why? Is because only those two adults furnish something to children that they crave, and that is their biological identity. Children have a very hard time answering the question, who am I? If they cannot answer the question, whose am I? These are, and you know what, for anybody that's worked with kids, I'm currently running the youth ministry at church. I've done youth ministry since I was in college. Every teenager is asking the question, who am I? And some of them decide, well, I'm a jock, or I'm a geek, or I'm a band nerd, or I'm a social justice warrior. These days, increasingly, it's I'm trans, I'm bi-curious, I'm a lesbian, whatever, right? Every kid is asking, who am I? And increasingly, because more and more kids are growing up in these fragmented homes where they are less connected to their own mother and father, it is harder for them to look outside of themselves. Here, give me a little Carl Truman, right? We no longer have these sort of external foundational sources to answer that question from, whether it's a religious foundation telling us who we are, an institutional aspect telling us who we are. It is only the internal sense of self that has the authority to tell us who we are. And children who don't have that biological connection with their mom and dad, that almost always is connected to a larger kinship network that says, I'll tell you who you are. You're the child of proud Italian immigrants who love to make, who we make our meatballs every Christmas, right? Or you are the product of the Mexican dad who came here as a 5-year-old, fought his way here, and is so grateful to be an American. But you know that we go home and we see Tita whenever whatever it is. If you are disconnected from your biological parents, you're often disconnected from your larger kinship network. And that has been historically one of the greatest sources of identity that children have. So we actually can see this, and we have measured it. We have done a 100% about-face change in our adoption policies in the last 60 years, where 60 years ago, almost every adoption was a closed adoption because the adoption world thought biology doesn't matter. Love makes a family. And all these kids need is to be loved by a mom and dad. And what they learned is, even if a child cannot be raised by their first family, these kids fare better when they have as much contact with their biological family, their family of origin as possible, even if they can't be raised by them. And so now 95% of adoptions are open adoptions because biology matters, because children want that biological identity. And now we've got a new crop of children who were intentionally separated from their genetic family through commercial processes, whether that's sperm donation, egg donation, or surrogacy, where these kids are saying, I have a fundamental human right to know both of my parents. This is my identity. And many of them will say, I hope to have a relationship with my donor. That would be their own biological parents. So there is something critical about and identity forming about being raised in this smallest of all societies where you're getting not just the conditions that maximize child thriving, but you're getting the strongest sources of information to answer the question, who am I? And without that, we have seen, thank you, Mary Eberstadt, that it's very hard for these kids to formulate a stable identity, or it's much harder for them to formulate this, and they're much more susceptible to the cultural messages that are more than happy to tell children who they are.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that question next about the idea of primal screams. Mary Eberstadt's research, the notion that divorces in the past manifestation of the sexual revolution, that past effort to pursue adult desires over children's needs, have actually given rise to the next phase, which is this frenzied search for identity that you described a moment ago, where children are no longer saying, I like sports, I like science fiction, I like makeup and Barbies, or I like softball. They're saying, I'm trans. I'm actually not my birth sex or gender. I'm attracted to the same sex. I am something in between. I'm along a spectrum. It's like this experimentation with sexual identity is the idea that it's connected with the trauma of the previous, to use that psychological language, it's sometimes appropriate, that trauma of that previous wound, which is the deprivation of identity in terms of family, in terms of mother and father, in terms of blood and kinship and relation, and saying, our your great Italian, grandfather came over and, what that sounds like I'm starting a mafia story here, but there's a real connection there. It seems to me between the two things. Has that been substantiated? Is there evidence for that? What do you think?
It's been substantiated. There's evidence for that. And I hate the word trauma because it is so overused. Just like I almost hate the word abuse, because I've seen people, like, it's not abusive when somebody disagrees with you. But, I think that this generation that has come of age in sort of a therapeutic world where everything is kind of put in the context of therapy, of trauma and abuse and all of that, that really it's like, no, you need resilience here, right? It's not that you need to withdraw. You need to take a little more personal responsibility. But it's interesting to me because you do have these adults who will say, well, it's abusive. I mean, like, and again, when I'm not children's writing, I am in the world of the church and ministering to people who are really struggling, who will say, well, it's abusive that my husband won't let me spend X amount of dollars or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Or it's traumatic, like the kind of things I'm experiencing is traumatic. And yet we minimize the genuine trauma of children so that we can achieve what we want, because they don't have the capacity to articulate, to speak up, to advocate on their behalf. And so where's the evidence? They actually did a study on children who experienced father loss, I believe from divorce, from death, or from incarceration. And they measured the telomeres of these kids. That would be the end caps of the chromosome, the part of the cell that is responsible for longevity and health in a lot of ways. And they found that the telomeres of boys especially were shorter than kids who were raised by their both who still had their father ever present in their life every day. And so we see that this parental loss, which today is increasingly taking place, not because of tragedy, not because of death, but because adult desires are being elevated above the rights and well-being of children. Adults are choosing child loss because they need to fulfill their own sexual identity, their sexual desires, their sexual ambitions. We are literally shortening the lifespans of children. That is trauma. That is the very physical manifestation of trauma. Here's another one. Children, girls who are raised apart from their biological father, on average, start their periods 1 year earlier. Like there is a physical manifestation of father absence in a girl's life. And that early menses, especially coupled with the father hunger that a lot of children experience when they grow up without the male love that they are made for in their home, is one of the main reasons why fatherless girls have drastically higher rates of teen pregnancy, right? And so we are elevating, I would say, normative adult struggles to the level of trauma, and we are minimizing genuine child trauma down to the level of, oh, it's just like a cold, they'll get over it.
These actual physical traumas that result testify against this sort of blank slate mentality that we have, that children can be essentially transplanted into any context that you want, and they'll be okay. And that's the mentality going back all the way to the rise of divorce culture in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that it doesn't really matter as long as there's love. And we've talked about why that's a fallacy. But, so much of this, Katy, seems to come back to a latent assumption that the family is an arbitrary construct. It essentially is perhaps it's something that the West decided to put together, and it's an organizational structure that came about as a result of the agrarian society or whatever. I mean, you could go into all these sort of sociological assertions about it, anthropological assertions about it. But at bottom is this sort of Rousseauian idea that people are really just blank slates. They can be made to conform to and thrive in any environment, in essence. And the family is arbitrary in character. It doesn't have to be what it is, and it doesn't even have to be. But the thing we're finding, it appears to be showing up again and again in this kind of measurable, verifiable trauma and damage and pain, is that the family is really natural. And by that, I mean that it's really part of who we are as human beings. I tweeted a while back that I think even some conservative Christians start to suffer sort of worldview slippage on this, where we think, the family, and I hear apologetics like this, and I'm not knocking it wholly, but I think that there's something dangerous here when we make an apologetic for the family along these lines, that, hey, male sexuality is brutal and promiscuous and dangerous, and the thing we have to civilize male sexuality is the family, right? So we contain it within a monogamous marriage, and we make it productive, and we make a man faithful to one woman with social strictures and legal ties to his kids and stuff, and boom, we're off to the races. We have a thriving, flourishing society. And there's some truth to that. And I think we can integrate that with the Christian idea of the fall, because male sexuality really is messed up and female sexuality is messed up. But male sexuality is the one more prone to sort of promiscuously conceive children and then abandon them. So we do need to tie kids and fathers together, women and men together. But I think that runs the risk of implying that the real natural state of humankind is non-familial, that we're really just, raising kids as a village, and that marriage is like Marx would say, the kind of a bourgeois imposition on the natural state of things, the state of nature, going back to Rousseau. But that's not how it actually is. In a biblical worldview, the family is the default. It's the natural state of human beings. This is where we're actually designed to live. And this is the real place where our sexuality is supposed to have its outlet. Am I on track there? Does that sort of track with what you're thinking? Because I look at that and I say, maybe we're opening ourselves up as Christians. We're making ourselves vulnerable to the assumptions of the culture when we actually have nature on our side, and we're forgetting that.
We have nature on our side. And, I'm so grateful for the Christian apologists who are making that case. It needs to be made. The Christian worldview is the only worldview that is going to be able to answer the critical question of what does it mean to be human? And that is at the source of all of our culture war issues, from abortion to marriage to transgenderism and assisted suicide and reproductive technologies, right? We need theologians and worldview voices to be making that case. but I will make that case from the child's perspective. And this is how that case goes. And I'll just sort of recreate a little bit something that you referenced earlier, the speech that I gave last September at the National Conservative Conference.
And we'll make sure to link to this because it was a very powerful talk. Yeah.
Well, and honestly, it came about because I heard John Stonestreet quote Vince Lombardi like 7 times. And I'm like, I should look up what he's talking about. Like, gentlemen, this is a football, right? So I went back and I looked at it, and it's all about Vince Lombardi, like his team, the Packers, like they blew this obvious win. They totally should have gotten it. And everybody comes back the next season. They're like, come on, coach, let's get back in here. Teach us the new plays. Show us what we got to do. We're going to crush them. And he holds up the pigskin and he goes, gentlemen, this is a football. And he just recreates and reemphasizes the basics. This is a tackle. This is a pass. And the team was like, what are you talking about? We know this stuff. And he's like, obviously you don't. Obviously you have forgotten the fundamentals of the game if this caliber of a team blows that easy of a lead. And so that's actually what's gone on with the conversation around marriage and family, especially in the West. And so in that speech, I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is a child. And I had a really adorable picture of a kid there that I referred to. This child is made when the gametes of one man and one woman come together to form a distinct new human. This child needs that mother and that father because statistically, they are the 2 adults who are most likely to make sure that she is safe and loved. This is a child. She is only going to be able to get her genetic and biological identity from that man and that woman. This is a child. She is made to have the distinctive benefits of both male and female love all throughout her development. And if she doesn't get it, she is not going to be developmentally optimized. This is a child. The only institution that is ever going to unite the 2 people to whom she has a natural right is the institution of marriage. This is a child. Every adult needs to bend so that her rights are met. This is a child. She is not an item to be cut and pasted into any and every adult relationship. She deserves to have you, the adult, conform to her rights. This is a child. She can't advocate for herself. She can't speak up. She doesn't blog. She can't submit amicus briefs. That is your job. This is a child. She is not going to change. Culture, law, and technology will not change these fundamentals of who she is. Your culture, your law, and your technology will either validate and protect her, or it is going to victimize her. Those are the only 2 options. And so if we look at the realities of the child, we see that the mother-father lifelong union is the only institution that is going to safeguard her rights and thriving and identity. And so we can and must make that case from a biblical perspective because, not coincidentally, it perfectly aligns with the rights of the child. And then I would also say that worldview slippage that you observe and caution Christians against, I will just say this to the Christians listening. Your worldview slippage is always going to be at the price of children's rights and well-being. If you go with the worldview slippage option, I would wager that it's because you are a little more concerned with what the culture or your friends think about you. And the connection needs to be very clear in your mind. I would rather have the approval of my friends than protect the rights and well-being of children. You do not get to have any illusions about what your worldview slippage is going to cost, and it's going to cost the least of these. And that is the no-go zone for Christians.
That's the payout. That's the cash out of what we're talking about here. If marriage is natural, if the family is real, if this is the default state of human beings, male and female, if we actually are created to be monogamous, as marriage entails, then that means somebody will pay the price for breaking that structure. It's like a string of computer code or a physical body or a machine. It's designed in a certain way. And as C.S. Lewis said, I have to give my obligatory C.S. Lewis quote, the human machine was meant to run on a certain juice. And if you try to fuel it with something else, it's going to break down. If you try to use it in a way that's not meant to be used, it's going to break down. And that looks like the kinds of ills, pathologies, and wounds that we're talking about here, because the human machine was made to be raised by a mother and a father who produced that person. And here's the thing, Katy, we live in a broken world. We live in a world that's fallen. You're an adoptive parent. you have no doubt engaged in dozens of arrangements over the course of your life that are both moral and good. Just from a worldly perspective, they're admirable. But they're the result of brokenness. They're things that you did because something went wrong. Either there was natural evil, just a misfortune or trial, or somebody sinned, and that caused victimization. It created a gap that needed to be filled. But those things are born out of tragedy. They can be beautiful, but they're born out of tragedy. The exceptions, in other words, prove the rule. They prove the thing that we're actually ideally suited for, which is that one man, one woman for life, and they're tied inextricably to their kids. They have a responsibility to their kids. And I feel like we just need to get that through our heads, because we have, even as Christians in some way, bought into the blank slate idea, the idea that we can really just create any arrangement. We can rearrange the pieces however we want and make it work. Well, not really. There's always a cost. And we can deal with the tragedy, but we have to first acknowledge the created good to orient ourselves. We're coming up on the end of our time here, and I want to ask this. To me, this is the hardest question. And this is the one that if I were in your shoes and somebody asked this to me, I don't know exactly how I'd answer because of the difficulties that we just got through talking about. You say that children have a right to the man and woman who made them. This is kind of the central claim, and we have to make this claim because marriage is where they belong. But how can we possibly live like that? Won't it force us to do things we can't actually, do in this broken, difficult world? Is it really possible to do that? And what challenges can we expect to face if we try?
All the challenges, Shane. We will face all the challenges. But that's really the thing, is we are talking about the most challenging intersections, most challenging burdens that humans are going to encounter in this fallen world. And, it's going to get back to someone's going to do the hard thing. So I'm not going to minimize the marriage struggles I've been in a 25-year marriage. We have had valleys. We are walking with other people who have challenges. And these are very hard things. These are major things that adults are going to deal with. Gut-wrenching, hard things. But if the adults refuse to do the hard work, what they're really saying is, hey kid, this cross is too heavy for me. Why don't you take it instead? That's really what you're saying. If someone is going to do the hard thing, is it going to be the adults or is it going to be the child? You look at situations of infertility. My friends who have struggled with infertility, they would say it is the hardest thing they've ever faced. And one of my friends said it's like the worst breakup month after month after month, over and over and over again. And you're worrying, no, not next month. I don't want it to be next month again. But if the adults think, well, having a biological child is really important to us. I have a right to children. I really want this. And you instead choose to find a sperm donor to create a child. Your fulfillment to have a biological connection with your child comes at the expense of the child having a biological connection with their own parent. And very likely, if they're like other kids created through third-party reproduction, are going to fantasize about, long for, miss this person that the world is telling them, oh, they're just a stranger. That's not your parent. The parents are the people that raised you. And so someone's going to do the hard thing there.
But Katy, I want to love that kid. And I long for a kid. I'm longing for a kid. Like as a person who can't have kids, I want a child. Why can't I have one?
Well, because you're swapping burdens, right? You're swapping your desire for a biological connection for their alienation from a biological connection. I would invite you, if you're questioning me about whether or not being loved and wanted is sufficient to cover that gaping hole where the biological parent should be. We give about 30 different stories of kids created through sperm and egg donation in chapter 7 of our book. I dare you, read it. If kids do have a right to their mother and father, I would also say that for children who have lost their mother or father through tragedy or through irresponsibility, who need homes, then it's probably you, Christian mom and dad, who have a strong marriage, who needs to go get them. Someone is going to do the hard thing. Is it going to be the kid who lives in the institution forever without the nurture and the love that they deserve and crave from a man and a woman united in marriage? Is it going to be them, or is it going to be you who folds another child into your home, who very likely may not have an easy road even once they join your family? But someone's going to do the hard thing in that situation. Is it going to be the adults, or is it going to be the kids? So if you believe that children have a right to their mother and father and adults need to do hard things, no adult gets a pass. If you are the adult that experiences same-sex attraction, who would be an awesome dad? What are you going to do? Are you going to form your family in a way where your romantic desires are met with another man, and then purchasing an egg, renting a womb, and raising the child in a purposefully motherless home? Or are you going to conform your desires to your children's right to be known and loved by both their mother and father, and sacrifice your sexual desires so the child's rights are protected? Someone's going to do the hard thing. Is it going to be the adult, or is it going to be the kid? This is a movement that says no adult gets a pass. If you really believe that children deserve their mother and father, it requires all adults to do hard things, probably at a variety of times in their life, and especially in a world where there's really nothing except the word of God saying your desires should be secondary. This is a very countercultural message, as you can imagine. And honestly, it's just very hard to live. So Godspeed. If you're a Christian, God will help you with this. This is he majors on this kind of thing. If you're not a Christian, take a look, because this Lord, who his entire story is about the strong sacrificing for the weak, he can help you, right? This is his jam.
It's a countercultural message for sure. It reminds me of this unusually wise internet meme I saw that said, life is going to be hard no matter what. So you can either choose the hard life of obesity and being physically unfit and all the diseases that attend that, or you can choose the hard life of physical fitness and keeping yourself in shape. You can choose the hard life of letting your sexual desires rule you and all the misery that will result from that. Or you can choose the hard life of restraining them and being chaste. And, you can choose the hard life of financial lack of restraint, profligate spending and so forth, and just going into debt. That's hard. It stinks to be in that place. Or you can choose the hard path of financial responsibility. But there's no easy path in the end. There's no path that doesn't require some pain. It's just whether you're going to sort of pay it up front and thrive as a result of it in the long term, or seek your thriving in the short term and pay in the long term. And here's the catch: with natural institutions like family, other people will suffer for your decisions, not just you. And that's the way the world works.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, in the children's rights language, I'll say, you're going to do the hard thing, or the kids are going to do the hard thing. If ever there's a time where the strong are forcing the weak to sacrifice on their behalf, that right there is an unjust system, whether it's happening on the personal level or the national level. God demands justice. And so he wants the justice in our personal life. And I would say he wants us to advocate for justice in our national conversation as well.
And you're doing a beautiful job doing that every single day with your speaking and your writing and just your public advocacy for this incredibly neglected and countercultural idea that children have a right to demand something of adults. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And I'll just wrap up. It's nice to hear you at 1.0 speed, because normally I get you at 1.5 speed, and it's very leisurely. And so those of you out there who are at 1.5, really you should slow it down every now and then, because this has been really enjoyable.
I had the same sort of experience when I always listen to podcasts at 1.25. I can't quite go up to 1.5. It sounds like a chipmunk, but it's the way to do it. It's the way to get through podcasts. Well, my guest today has been Katy Faust, author, children's rights advocate, founder and president of Them Before Us. Katy, thanks so much for joining me on Upstream and calling us back to these neglected truths.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media and find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.